The committee will come to order. I want to welcome everybody to today's hearing titled America's Affordable Housing Crisis, Challenges and Solutions. This is an important issue, and this hearing will allow the committee to hear from experienced and well-educated witnesses who can provide more context on our affordable housing policies and the sections of the tax code that were written with the intent of mitigating this long-time set of problems in our society. As many of you are aware, the last time we underwent a national comprehensive revision of the tax code was in 1986, with the passage of the Tax Reform Act. At that time, affordable housing tax incentives were baked into statute, with the low-income housing tax credit being chief among them. Since then, this important section of the tax code has enjoyed bipartisan support. Still, it is worth examining this particular law as we continue to ramp up our work on tax reform. Throughout today's hearing, I want each member to keep in mind some guiding principles for tax reform. I've repeated these principles quite a bit in recent years, but for those in the audience who may not have heard me mention them, the principles are fairness, efficiency, simplicity, and American competitiveness. These principles are important within the context of affordable housing tax policy because they should be able to help us improve upon what is currently in the code. I know the prospect of more oversight can be seen as a challenge, but I think we should all view this, this examination as an opportunity to determine where we can improve. While some sections of the tax code have undergone changes over the past 3 decades, solutions on affordable housing remain as elusive as ever. There seem to remain many households facing cost burdens associated with renting, with perhaps as much as 26% of renter households having paid more than half of their incomes in rent in 2015, for example. And the burdens seem to fall heavily on lower income households, and this is not just simply a problem of arithmetic. In 2015, 25 million children lived in households in which rent comprised a fairly large share of household income. This is a problem that should be ready for a bipartisan solution. We've already introduced bipartisan legislation to address some of these issues, and many are hopeful that cooperation on these efforts will continue. I personally believe they will. With that, I would just like to thank everyone for attending today, and I look forward to hearing from our distinguished panel of witnesses. But before we get to that, I'd like to hand it over to the ranking member, Senator Wyden, for his opening remarks at this time.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Chairman, let me thank you for focusing today on the low-income housing tax credit, which is a key part of the tax reform puzzle. I also want to thank our colleague from Washington State, Senator Cantwell, who has been for years now the go-to person on this committee on this issue. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the history of it in a minute. I'd also like to note there was a lot of talk last week about bipartisanship and bipartisanship on key issues. That's what this committee is showing today, that we're serious about tackling an important issue in a bipartisan way. Colleagues, my bottom line is America's housing policy needs an urgent remodel. Today, millions of Americans struggle to pay the rent, and they can't even dream of purchasing a home. To recall our old classes on Introduction to Economics, a key housing challenge is increasing supply. When housing is scarce in the communities where people want to live and work, prices get bid up and working people get pushed out. Rent rises faster than people's incomes, even among those who are earning a pretty good salary. And there are few incentives to build affordable housing near schools, public transit, and amenities like parks and retail services. Oftentimes, the only places where people can afford housing means that they are going to have to take an hour or more from where they work or where they want their kids to go to school every single day. And a lot of Americans either spend a small fortune on train tickets and bus fares, or they spend an eternity sitting behind a steering wheel on the daily commute. And a lot of our folks wind up in food deserts where it's almost impossible to get healthy, fresh food. This crisis is a 5-alarm fire across America, and it's certainly true in my home state of Oregon. In Portland, Bend, Hood River, Astoria, Medford, and a lot of other places, I see it on the faces of families, children, vets, and folks that are living on the streets. Now, Senator Cantwell and Senator Hatch have gotten an important bill that I've co-sponsored. It's entitled the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act of 2017. In effect, it supercharges the low-income housing tax credit, and it also builds on what the three of us got into the 2015 tax bill, which made the expanded low-income housing tax credit permanent. In my view, this is a bipartisan, smart way to attack the housing scarcity problem, and it's going to mean more housing goes up in communities where folks want to work and plant roots. In the days ahead, I'm going to have other ideas about the housing challenge, particularly about helping the middle class and first-time homebuyers, and doing a better job of linking services like transportation, with low-income housing. Today, we're going to talk to our witnesses about some of the ideas that Senator Cantwell and Hatch have put forward, and I want to thank the two of them, and particularly note that after the events of last week, colleagues, it is more important than ever to be very concrete about this issue of bipartisanship and not just make it a rhetorical talking point. That's what we're doing today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you, Senator. I also would like to thank Senator Cantwell. She was the one who suggested this hearing, and we've gone out of our way to make sure that we have it. And I just want to thank you for your efforts in this regard. I'd like to welcome each of our 5 witnesses today. I'm confident we have some of the nation's greatest minds and experts on housing and urban development matters. First, we will hear from Mr. Daniel Garcia Diaz, Director of Financial Markets and Community Investment Group at the United States Government Accountability Office. Mr. Garcia Diaz leads a range of reviews covering mortgage finance, rental housing, economic development, and insurance. Specifically, he led recent reviews of management issues in the Department of Housing and Urban Development, home ownership and affordable rental housing, low-income housing tax credit, and the federal terrorism risk insurance programs. He has also led reviews of programs and regulatory changes authorized under the Emergency Economic Stabilization Act and the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Act. Mr. Garcia Diaz joined GAO in 1998. He holds a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College and a master's degree in public policy from Harvard University's Kennedy School of Government. Then we will hear from Mr. Grant S. Whittaker, President of the National Council of State Housing Agencies. Mr. Whittaker hails from my home state of Utah and has been extraordinarily helpful as we have prepared for this hearing. He has dedicated his career to serving the financial needs of low and moderate income families back in our home state of Utah. He currently serves as President and CEO of the Utah Housing Corporation, a self-supporting state-sponsored public corporation which has been funding and promoting affordable housing in Utah since 1977. Mr. Whittaker was appointed to this position, or to the position of President and CEO in January 2009 and has served in that capacity since that time. But Mr. Whittaker's experience at UHC started back in 1979, before the last time we reformed the tax code. Mr. Whittaker earned a bachelor's degree in business management from the University of Utah's David Eccles School of Business. Subsequently, he worked on postgraduate studies at the University of Utah and through the university's professional education division. Third will be the Honorable Dr. Catherine O'Regan, Professor of Public Policy and Planning at NYU's Wagner Graduate School of Public Service, where she is also the faculty director of the Furman Center for Real Estate and Urban Policy. Dr. O'Regan recently served from April 2014 to January 2017 as the Assistant Secretary for Policy Development and Research at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. Her primary research interests are at the intersection of poverty and space. Among others, she has served on the board of the Reinvestment Fund, the advisory board for NYU's Mcclure Institute for Poverty, Policy, and Research, and the editorial board for the Journal of Policy Analysis and Management. She has been a visiting scholar at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and the Economic Studies Group at the Brookings Institution. Dr. O'Regan holds a PhD in economics from the University of California at Berkeley and spent 10 years teaching at the Yale School of Management. Then we will hear from Dr. Kirk Mcclure from the Urban Planning Program at the University of Kansas. Dr. Mcclure has won several awards for his research on housing and urban planning. His academic career has also included an appointment as scholar in residence to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. He serves on the Board of Editors of Housing Studies and the Journal of Planning, Education, and Research. He is Associate Editor of Housing Policy Debate. Dr. Mcclure holds a Master of City Planning degree from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and a PhD degree from the University of California at Berkeley. And finally, Mr. Granger McDonald, Chairman of the Board of Directors for the National Association of Home Builders and President of the McDonald Companies. Mr. McDonald is a Caryville, Texas-based builder and developer with 40 years of experience in the home building industry. His company, McDonald Companies, provides affordable housing for communities in need in the state's rural and small metro areas. Mr. McDonald also has extensive experience working in the NAHB leadership, including more than 30 years on the NAHB Board of Directors and chairing the Federal Government Affairs Committee, the State and Local Government Affairs Committee, the Housing Credit Group, the Multifamily Council, and Build PAC. Mr. McDonald holds a BBA degree in Real Estate and Finance from the University of Texas School of Business. We'll start with you, Mr. Garcia Diaz. You'll kick this off with your opening remarks, if you will.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Wyden, members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to be here today to discuss GEO's work on the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, the nation's largest source of federal assistance for developing affordable rental housing. Over the past 3 years, GEO has completed 3 reviews of this program. We have a current effort underway looking at development costs under the program. We have worked with a total of 17 different allocating agencies in 14 states and in the district in conducting these 4 reviews. I want to recognize the cooperation of these agencies during our site visits and in responding to requests for information. We look forward to continuing a productive working relationship with them. As you know, the Internal Revenue Service is in charge of administering the LIHTC program, while state and local allocating agencies are responsible for day-to-day implementation of the program. My statement today focuses on allocating agencies' implementation of federal requirements and IRS's oversight of the program. We found that allocating agencies have implemented varying processes to address key federal requirements, but we have some concerns that I would like to highlight in my remarks, which are discussed more fully in our prior reports. Allocating agencies are responsible for alerting IRS about any property noncompliance. Problems with property physical condition are the most common form of noncompliance. We found that agencies varied in when they submitted noncompliance reports to IRS, what types of violations were reportable, and the level of supporting details provided. Because of these differences, it is not surprising that the number of submitted noncompliance reports from 9 agencies we examined ranged from as little as 1 to more than 1,700 in a 1-year period. And in fact, we are aware that some agencies have submitted a few or no compliance reports to IRS over a 3-year period, and IRS has not followed up with them. Furthermore, we also found that IRS does very little to assess the noncompliance information it receives. IRS has no method to determine if issues reported have been resolved or if properties have recurring noncompliance issues. In addition, we also found that critical data on allocation amounts and certification were not complete and reliable. For example, we could not tell how often LIHTC properties were placed in service within required timeframes. Across these findings, a common problem has been that IRS oversight of this program has been minimal. Over the past 30 years, IRS has audited allocating agencies 7 times. Yet, even when these audits were conducted, they often yielded multiple findings, including agency policies that conflict with the code or Treasury regulation, incomplete or outdated qualified allocation plans, annual reports to IRS with errors, and so on. We have some thoughts on how to strengthen oversight and accountability in the LIHTC program. First, with respect to noncompliance reporting, we made 2 recommendations that IRS clarify when agencies should report noncompliance and evaluate how it could improve noncompliance information by leveraging HUD's physical inspection data systems. These recommendations remain open. Second, in response to our concern about data quality, we recommended that IRS should address weaknesses in controls to ensure reliable data are collected on credit allocations. IRS has not completed implementation of this recommendation, but is taking steps to improve it. And finally, and more significantly, we continue to believe that we continue to believe that HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, can be a resource to augment IRS's oversight capabilities. Other tax credit programs, such as new markets and historic rehabilitation, have formal partnerships grounded in statute with a relevant subject matter agency to assist in oversight, data collection, analysis, and reporting, and technical assistance. HUD is well positioned to assist allocating agencies' efforts to monitor physical and financial condition of properties, address federal fair housing goals, and perform other tasks that are common in managing affordable rental housing programs, all areas which IRS has no specific expertise. Over the past 30 years, LIHTC has matured to be the most significant federal policy tool for incentivizing the production of affordable housing nationwide. We believe that investing in oversight and accountability will help ensure that agencies meet program requirements, use federal resources effectively, and ultimately achieve the nation's goal of providing poor and vulnerable families safe, decent, and affordable housing, which is so desperately needed today. This concludes my opening remarks. Thank you again for the opportunity to speak today. I would be glad to take any questions you have.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Wyden, members of the committee, thank you for this opportunity to testify on behalf of the National Council of State Housing Agencies. I'm Grant Whittaker, President and Chief Executive Officer of the Utah Housing Corporation. I also serve as President of NCSHA, a nonpartisan national organization that represents state housing finance agencies. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Senator Cantwell, for your steadfast support of the low-income housing tax credit and tax-exempt private activity housing bonds. And thank you for your leadership in introducing the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act, S. 548. I also want to acknowledge Senator Wyden and the many other members of the committee who have co-sponsored this bill. We urge all senators to become co-sponsors. The housing credit and bond programs have long enjoyed strong bipartisan support, and this bill is no exception. Already, nearly one-third of senators, Republicans and Democrats, have co-sponsored this legislation. The House companion legislation also has significant bipartisan backing. The need for affordable rental housing across the country is great and growing. Nearly half of all renters pay an excessive share of their income for housing, and the crisis is most acute for the poorest households. Simply put, we have a severe shortage of affordable rental homes. Nationwide, there are more than 11 million extremely low-income renter households, but only 4 million rental homes are available and affordable to them. This shortage continues to grow as hundreds of thousands of new renter households enter the market each year, while we lose countless affordable homes to conversion and obsolescence. The housing crisis impacts working families, seniors, people with disabilities, and so many more, those living in high-cost cities, suburban neighborhoods, and rural communities. Coastal cities like Seattle are well known for their extreme housing costs. Low-income households in Utah also struggle to find affordable housing. Over 58,000 renter households in my state pay more than half of their income for housing, and we have a shortage of over 38,000 homes that are affordable and available to the extremely low-income households. We are not unique. Every state confronts this challenge. This crisis will only get worse unless we act. If current rent and income trends continue, the number of severely cost-burdened renters, those paying 50% or more of their income for rent, will reach nearly 15 million nationwide by 2025. That's a 25% increase. The housing credit and bonds are the most effective response. These are highly successful private-public partnerships with a proven track record. They're administered by publicly accountable HFAs that take seriously the responsibility for their operation and oversight that you have entrusted to us. States deploy these resources to respond to the needs we determine to be most pressing. The housing credit and bonds create quality, affordable homes for families, seniors, people with special needs, veterans, and those experiencing homelessness. The stable housing created improves lives by supporting better health, education, and employment outcomes. These programs also contribute to economic growth by creating jobs and generating tax revenue. In Utah, we've had great success using the housing credit and the housing bonds. We've made considerable progress, for example, in reducing our chronically homeless population. In fact, Utah Housing Corporation will devote 30% of our 2018 Housing Credit Authority to supportive housing properties, moving us closer to the goal of ending chronic homelessness. But we still have significant work ahead as we continue to tackle family homelessness and help the many low-income households who pay more rent than they can afford. NCSHA urges you to seize the opportunity of tax reform or other legislation that may advance this year to build on what works. We ask you to increase Housing Credit Authority and make the other critical program changes you proposed in S548, such as facilitating the development of mixed income, rural, and deeply income-targeted housing. Current Housing Credit Authority is oversubscribed by a measure of nearly 3-to-1 nationally. Meanwhile, reliance on the credit continues to grow as other federal resources shrink and new demands are placed on the credit. Finally, we ask you to mitigate any unintentional negative effects, the changes you make to the tax code that might appear on the housing credit and bond programs. Thank you for your commendable efforts to address the affordable housing crisis. I'm honored to have had this opportunity to testify, and we stand ready to assist you in any way that we can.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Reagan.
Thank you. Chairman Hatch, Ranking Member Wyden, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to appear today. I want to begin by reminding people of a few facts about America's affordable housing crisis. As stated, the housing cost burdens are extremely high, particularly for renters. Nearly half of all renters were cost burdened in 2015, and more than a quarter faced severe cost burdens. So they were spending more than 50% of their income on housing costs. These rates remain far above pre-recession levels, and the challenges are widespread, extending beyond high-cost cities and lowest-income households. At least 37% of renter households in each state across the nation were cost burdened in 2014. And the sharpest growth in cost burdens over the past 15 years has been among middle-income households. And finally, housing supply is simply not keeping up with demand. Housing completions in the last 10 years were lower than any other 10-year period since the late 1970s. The rental vacancy rate is at its lowest level in 30 years. So what to do about it? In terms of the federal response and tax policy, the main lever is the low-income housing tax credit, LIHTC. So I'll focus my comments there. With more than 30 years of LIHTC experience to build on, it is an opportune time for reforming and streamlining LIHTC. I want to highlight 3 critical areas for reform that are greatly facilitated by Senate Bill 548, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act of 2017. First is working in a broader set of markets across a broader set of incomes. While LIHTC's federal income limits are tied to 50 or 60% of area median income, states are also required to prioritize developments reaching lowest income tenants. And indeed, nearly half of LIHTC tenants have incomes below 30% of area median income, AMI. Serving such households with extremely low incomes requires some form of additional rental assistance, such as vouchers or other development level subsidies. Yet those additional subsidies are in decreasing supply, may not be within the control of the housing agency or developer, and even if available, require coordination and layering across multiple funding streams. Income averaging can help address these challenges as well as improve economic feasibility in different market settings. It permits developments to employ an average income cap of 60% of AMI with no household's income exceeding 80% of AMI. Higher rents can be used to offset lower rents. And a broader set of incomes can be served where the additional resources needed to reach low-income households comes from within the finances of the development itself. This cross-subsidy will be useful in high-cost markets, for developments in that are part of a mixed-income community revitalization plan, and in rural markets where it may be necessary to serve a broader set of income ranges to be economically feasible. This greater flexibility is one of the most important LIHTC reforms. Permitting states to increase maximum basis boosts for serving extremely low-income tenants adds a similar flexibility, providing resources from within the tax credit itself for reaching lowest-income tenants. And broadening the definition of difficult development areas to automatically include Indian areas would enable the credit to work in a high-need environment that has been underserved. The second area is achieving locational goals. Citing LIHTC in higher opportunity neighborhoods or ensuring that LIHTC investments contribute to neighborhood revitalization requires two reforms contained in S548. Prohibiting local approval and contribution requirements, which can act as local vetoes, and clarifying the state's authority to determine the definition of community revitalization plan. The third area is preservation of existing affordable housing, which is a key and potentially cost-effective strategy for narrowing the demand-supply gap. This would be greatly aided by the establishment of a permanent minimum for the 4% credit. Finally, on LIHTC resources. Expected declines in the corporate tax rate are estimated to decrease LIHTC resources by up to 17% in the future. Failure to increase the per capita allocation is equivalent to cutting LIHTC resources relative to recent years. Given the breadth and depth of the affordability issues across the country, now does not seem a time to withdraw federal resources for affordable housing. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much. We'll now turn to Mr. Mcclure. Mr. McClure.
Chairman Hatch, Ranking Member Wyden, members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to address you on this very important topic. The Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program is the nation's primary affordable housing production program. It's a good program, but it's one that is in need of improvements to make it perform better. I'd like to make three observations about the performance of the program and use those observations to support recommendations to help it be a better fit with current housing market conditions. The first issue answers the question, does the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program produce units in the price range where there's a shortage of units? And here, sadly, the answer is no. Generally, rents on tax credit units fall in the range of $500 to $1,000 a month. If a household is to spend no more than 30% of income to afford these units, these incomes need to be in the $20,000 to $40,000 per year range. When we examine rental markets across the nation, we find that there is, in fact, no shortage of units in this price range. Rather, the number of units is far in excess of the number of households with these incomes. When we shift to the lowest tier, we look at the rental markets below this one, we see there is a significant mismatch. The number of households with incomes below $20,000 is far in excess of the number of apartments available for under $500. What this means is that the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program is adding units to the market segment that already is in surplus, but is unable to reach far enough down to the households who suffer from a shortage. So a first reform would be to ask state housing finance agencies to exercise greater rigor in their market analysis and to certify for the need for each tax credit development, supported by independent, not developer-driven market analysis. A second reform would be to permit state housing finance agencies to exchange tax credit authority for voucher authority. The vouchers could be freestanding where that's appropriate to the marketplace, or they could be attached to the project. The vouchers would permit a poorer population to afford the unit, with the tenant contribution importantly set at 30% of their income, not at the flat rent. This would eliminate the cost burden for these households. The second issue seeks to answer the question, does the low-income housing tax credit program add new units to tight markets and rehabilitate existing units in soft markets? And the answer here is not very well. Typically, the program should add new units where we have tight markets, very low vacancy rates, and should rehabilitate existing units in soft markets where we have very high vacancy rates. Built into the tax credit program is a favor toward new construction. 9% credits are awarded against new construction costs. 4% credits are offered against rehabilitation costs, independent of market conditions. Developers have responded appropriately by developing 45% more new construction units than rehabilitation, favoring new construction, whether it's a tight, normal, or soft market. This problem can be rectified by reconfiguring the benefits of the tax credit program to favor rehab in soft markets and to permit new construction only where a market is very tight or is eliminating severely dilapidated units for replacement. The final point asks the question, does the low-income housing tax credit program support mixed-income housing? And sadly, again, the answer here is no. Research demonstrates that projects wholly populated by the poor are not good for the households, not good for the projects, and not good for the surrounding neighborhoods. Mixed-income housing is a much more beneficial format for all concerned. The tax credit program provides no incentives for mixed-income housing. As a result, 76% of all tax credit developments are occupied entirely by subsidized low-income households. Fewer than 3% are configured with more than one-half of all units at market rates. The program can be improved by reconfiguring the benefits of the tax credit program to favor mixed-income developments, prohibit wholly subsidized developments except in very distressed markets where mixed-income developments are not feasible. The tax credit program remains an important tool for resolving the nation's affordability problems. With improvements, it can be made better. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Mr. McDonald, we'll turn to you.
Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today. My company specializes in the construction and management of affordable rental housing. We currently own and manage 4,700 units throughout Texas. For the past 20 years, I've built affordable rental housing with the low-income housing tax credit. We are here today because the housing affordability has reached crisis proportions. The number of renter households who are severely cost-burdened, meaning they have more than half of their monthly income on rent, is at an all-time high of 11.4 million people. This is 1 in 4 renters. The first step to solving this crisis is to pass Senate Bill 548, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act of 2017. I want to thank Senator Cantwell, Senator Hatch, and all the bipartisan co-sponsors. Bipartisanship seems to be rare these days, and I hope we can all unite around this bill and take action this year. The challenge we face is inadequate supply to meet the growing demand. S548 will increase the supply, most noticeably by boosting the tax credit allocations by 50%. In addition, creating the 4% floor will allow more units to be preserved and developed using housing bonds. Our housing stock ages. The first tax credit projects are now 30 years old. Preservation and rehabilitation is a cost-effective tool, and fixing the 4% credit will really help that. Enacting this bill is expected to result in an additional 400,000 tax credit units over the next 10 years. That added construction activity would increase the federal tax revenue by $11.4 billion. To get to the root of the crisis, we need to look at the challenges facing developers. There is no magic wand to erase the basic development cost. Fees, regulatory compliance, modern building and energy codes, building materials, land and labor costs determine what rents are needed to make a project viable. The bottom line is if we want to increase the supply of affordable rental housing for lower income households, it is financially impossible to do without the tax credit. The tax credit is the most successful affordable housing production program in our nation's history. Part of the success is the advantage of creating it in the tax code. Investors have the confidence in the predictability of the tax code, which ensures a fairly constant supply of affordable housing. And tax credit communities outperform the rest of the multifamily sector in the annualized foreclosure rate. This rate is less than 0.1%. But it lacks the resources to keep up with demand. Without a sizable investment in our housing stock, particularly as older units reach obsolescence, we risk a worsening problem. Rental housing demands remains as solid as expected to grow even stronger. Absent new supply, of this demand will increase rents and worsen the affordability issues we now have. We also need to recognize the important role affordable housing plays in our communities. I see how affordable housing creates stability for my tenants and their families. My properties also help revitalize neighborhoods and break the cycle of poverty that starts with access to stable and affordable housing. The housing affordability crisis affects our economy as well. Housing affordability is critical in areas experiencing robust economic growth. But our fellow citizens cannot afford to live where the jobs are because we are just creating a divide based on housing cost. Some criticize the program for not directing more affordable housing to higher income areas. Let me shed some light on these challenges that I face as a developer. In Texas, unless you have the blessing of the local community to put an affordable housing project there, the state agency will never award me an allocation. In many higher income areas, as soon as you utter the word affordable, the discussion often turns ugly and may take on racial overtones. This is the reality for affordable housing developers face every day. Fortunately, some relief is possible. Senate Bill 548 will prohibit states from requiring special local approval of tax credit developments. This will ensure that if the zoning allows it, an affordable project will be treated just like any other development. We have an opportunity to do something not only that makes good economic sense, but will uplift the lives of millions of Americans. I greatly appreciate the bipartisan support for 548 and urge the committee to pass it as soon as possible.
Well, thank you so much. You've been an excellent panel, and I think we've learned a lot from you. Let me just ask this question to Mr. Whittaker and Mr. McDonald. One reason I support the low-income housing tax credit program is that it keeps decision-making on affordable housing away from a centralized bureaucratic agency in Washington, D.C., and allows decisions to be made within the communities where the housing is needed, while involving the private sector. Can both of you discuss how that helps you decide what projects to build and how the public-private partnership aspect of the program promotes more spending in affordable housing than would happen if only the government was involved?
In Utah, we offer up two different opportunities for developers, syndicators, advocates, public entities, private entities, nonprofits to come in and talk to us. There's a mandatory public hearing that we hold, and we also hold another one earlier in the session to get input on how we should run our program, specifically how we should modify our qualified allocation plan. So we get a lot of input from the industry partners through this effort. Obviously, they don't agree with themselves all the time, and so we have to ferret that out. But we also look at needs that are happening. So a moment ago, I mentioned that we are going to set aside 30% of next year's allocation for supportive housing because we know there's a horrendous homeless issue that's taking place right downtown Salt Lake City right now. And that's a problem that can't be solved if there isn't some permanent place for them to be housed. So we work diligently with governmental entities in the private sector to try to find out how we can utilize these very scarce resources the best that we can to meet the needs of our population.
Well, thank you.
And I'd just like to add to that,
Yes.
every state has its own qualified allocation process, which allows a decentralization of how the tax credits are allocated. They're allocated more based on what the citizens of a specific state need. Every state's needs are slightly different than another, and it allows them to be more addressed. Based on the economic trends in a state, the housing trends in a state, and the demographic changes that are always occurring across a state. For example, my home state of Texas is a large state, and we go from one very rural area to very urban areas, to the necessity for family housing, to necessity for seniors housing. And so it lets everything stay in balance. Our local state agency does a wonderful job of this last year of changing the balance between families and seniors housing. And it was very, very important, and it's an extremely well-balanced process, because just what Mr. Whittaker said, that we're able to address all of these issues on a local state basis with lots of public and private input, public hearings, and the citizens and everyone gets to benefit from those decisions.
Well, let me ask another question for Grant Whittaker. One of the series of reports that the GAO has published on the low-income housing tax credits recently notes that it does not appear that the IRS is doing very much oversight of the program. And while federal oversight of this program is important, I know that there is much oversight that takes place at the state housing authority level. As president of the National Council of State Housing Agencies, and especially as president and CEO of the Utah Housing Corporation, can you discuss how you ensure that your credit allocation is wisely and prudently awarded, and how you monitor the use of these credits?
Starting with the allocation process, we have a process that's outlined very clearly in our qualified allocation plan. It's based on those projects that score the highest in the area, in the pools that we set aside for them, how that's allocated. So the best projects are the ones who are awarded credits. In terms of the compliance of the properties, we have a team of compliance auditors that look at properties on a more regular basis for those who've got problems, who exhibit problems in their properties, and less often of those who are in full compliance as we go around. But this team looks at the financial records, it looks at the rent rolls, it looks at the physical conditions of the properties. We do submit reports to the IRS, those that will imply that if they don't fix these things, that the tax benefit can go away from the investors. We make sure that the development company that's managing the projects know that that's happening, and we think we get some pretty darn good compliance from our projects in Utah.
Well, thank you so much, Senator Wyden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all. It's been an excellent panel. And I want to ask first about some questions that relate to the overall tax reform puzzle, because as you know, these pieces are interrelated. Mr. Whittaker, for you, the low-income housing tax credit is a tax credit that is often claimed by corporate partners like banks in qualifying for low-income housing tax projects. Reducing the corporate tax rate could reduce the value of the low-income housing tax credit and thus investor demand. We've heard some talk about the credit declining by up to 17%. So what do you think needs to be done to make sure that as we get into tax reform, that the credit is kept whole?
Thank you, Senator. Yes, we do see that. We've already seen that, not so much in Utah. I think we're a little bit blessed with the CRA-hungry industrial banks, so our credit pricing hasn't gone as much as it has in other areas. But we do recognize through the National Council of State Housing Agencies that this is very critical to some of the areas. Some of the HFAs are handling their allocations in different ways to try to get that out there so that the properties do work, so that they do pencil. And going forward with S548, we recognize that there isn't a mechanism in there right now that would enable us to increase the benefit of the tax code such that as pricing might go down on tax credits, that as corporate tax rates go down, that there isn't a mechanism built in there, but we think that there are some opportunities for that to happen.
Why don't you, for the record, get us those ideas? Because I think one of the areas I'm going to concentrate on is trying to make sure that as we look at these critically important needs, like increasing the supply of low-income housing, that we make sure that it fits into the tax reform puzzle and we don't end up having an inadvertent problem as a result of, say, a reduction in the corporate rate and lowering the value of the credit. Ms. Reagan, let's go to you. In my town hall meetings at home, I go to every county every year, I hear from folks at home who are just apoplectic about having to live in one place and then drive hither and yon to get to work, to take their kids to school, buy groceries, get medical care, and so on. And I'm always struck by how people in politics just preach morning, noon, and night about family values. Pretty hard to get family values when you spend your 2 hours a day just commuting, driving family members to the places they need to go. What are your ideas about how we could do more in a practical way to link low-income housing with transportation and services and the like? I mean, you don't want to just do some kind of one-size-fits-all national mandate from Washington, D.C., but you do want to say, let's really wring the value out of this low-income credit. I mean, I think that's really what Senator Cantwell and Chairman Hatch are trying to do. Let's wring every bit of value out of this low-income credit. You have any thoughts on what could be done to make sure that when you build this housing, it is more closely tied to the services like transportation and schools and health that low-income folks need?
Thank you, Mr. Senator. Yes, this is a big issue. We talk about the cost of housing, and we should be talking about the cost of housing and transportation when we think about what it is that families pay in order to make their life work. There are some states who have been very aggressive in this, in their qualified allocation plan, where they use their ability to apply basis boosts and priority points in a way that prioritizes not just low poverty neighborhoods, but neighborhoods that have good access to transit and good schools. So I think there's a lot that can be learned from what states have done in the last 5 to 10 years. I also think you need to be getting a broader group of stakeholders in some of these meetings because employers really care whether or not the workforce is within driving distance. And so they have a role to play in making sure that the collection of resources, not just LIHTC, but local resources that look at where the housing is located and the transit dollars to make sure that they're being used in a way that works well for the whole community.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Grassley.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Garcia Diaz, for GAO doing some studies I've asked you to do. So I have some issues I'd like to have you comment on. The organization has found that basic LIHTC data, including credit allocations, certification information, building dispositions, and program non-compliance, is either not collected or rarely used. So could you describe what steps were taken to gather the information and how this lack of data impacted GAO's ability to analyze basic program information?
Thank you, Senator. Essentially, the LIHTC program, from our perspective, is a very hard program to review. The lack of information at a federal level, basic information about allocation awarded to projects, placed in service dates, which are critical requirements in the program, is just very difficult for us to review. And what's more, when we ask the IRS to provide us information on how many properties had a recapture, for instance, because of non-compliance, IRS wasn't able to provide us with that information. And so we're very concerned that on these basic accountability measures that IRS and no one else in the federal government really has an idea of what's going on. That's not to say that the program is a bad one or anything like that, but these are basic accountability requirements that we would expect of any program. And especially one as important as this one.
Okay. GAO is currently examining development costs of LIHTC properties. What are some of your preliminary observations about this data that you're collecting and the types of activity allocating agencies are doing to manage costs?
So on the first part of your question, we are developing a database on development cost of LIHTC projects for 12 different allocating agencies, representing the period where properties were placed in service between 2011 and 15. This information does not exist in a central location, and so we've had to go to individual allocating agencies to collect it. It has taken us well over a year and a half to build this database, but we have amassed about 1,900 projects representing 122,000 units. And we hope early next year to be able to report out on our cost estimates, and our plan is to actually meet with the individual allocating agencies, share what we've done with the data, so that we can see are there ways to build a data capacity in this program, and particularly at the allocating agency level, so that they can assess the reasonableness of their costs. Right now, in our interviews with the 12 agencies, we're seeing a range of practice regarding assessing the reasonableness of project costs. Part of that is driven by the availability of analyzable data at the agency level. And so we've identified certain agencies that really, while they may have some cost limits that they impose on project applications, they don't essentially assess the reasonableness of the cost. Other agencies are using the analyst's judgment on whether the cost is reasonable. And then finally, you have another group of agencies that are actually doing pretty sophisticated analysis using statistical regression to look at outliers and better understand the data. So we're seeing quite a bit of variety in the sophistication of the agencies in analyzing costs and ensuring that credits are used as cost effectively as possible.
Okay. We often hear from LIHTC industry participants that syndicators provide the necessary program oversight because they have the vested interest in ensuring the program runs effectively. So, Mr. Garcia Diaz, do you believe that this is sufficient oversight?
I wouldn't say it's sufficient. It's an important component of oversight. The syndicators are a very important player in this program. And actually, if you look across past affordable housing programs, we've never actually had an entity like this that does monitor projects and perform their own audits and reviews and other kind of asset management services. However, I don't think this relieves the federal government of responsibility of having basic performance information about LIHTC and particularly understanding the extent of noncompliance.
Yeah. For Mr. Whittaker and Dr. Mcclure, in his written statement, Dr. Mcclure raised, and this will have to be my last question, Dr. Mcclure raised concern that state housing agencies fail to conduct rigorous market analysis to build LIHTC units in areas with the greatest need. As a result, he finds that most LIHTC projects are not being built in areas experiencing a housing shortage. So, Mr. Whittaker, could you comment on whether or not you agree with Dr. Mcclure's concerns, and two, what policies are in place at state housing agencies to identify where projects are most needed?
Thank you, Senator. I think, first of all, I can speak mostly on behalf of my own state. However, the Council of State Housing Agencies is putting together, with participation by all allocating entities, some best practices that would probably improve those who are not doing quite as well. But in terms of what we require, we mandate that we get a market study with the application that is submitted for the tax credits. And the market studies have to be fairly new. I think they cannot be more than 6 months old or 90 days. I'm not sure which. But we do look at those very carefully. We also have some of the market studies done independently in some areas where we are concerned about what's happening. So there's a couple of rural counties in Utah where we can see the rent rolls, and some projects that we funded with tax credits a number of years ago are having high vacancy rates, and so we don't accept applications in those counties. So we're very careful about that. We haven't seen the kind of problem that he described, at least in my state, so it's a little hard for me to describe what might be happening in other places.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Stabenow.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for this very important hearing. And I first want to indicate my strong support for S 548. Looking forward to being a co-sponsor. I know we are doing this in twos, Republican and Democrat coming on together, so I'm looking forward to that. But I want to commend Senator Cantwell and yourself, Mr. Chairman, for this important legislation. I hope we're going to be able to move it through the process quickly. I do have one issue that has come up, though, that Mr. Whittaker, I thought might start with you if anyone else has any thoughts on it. But this is affordable housing is so critical, whether it's rental or purchasing, building, and so on. But we've had a very concerning issue come up in Michigan related to the low-income housing tax credit. We have at least one developer who has essentially foreclosed on their own properties to try to avoid the affordability requirements under the tax credit. And obviously, this is not what was intended. And you can't just simply plan foreclosures so you can circumvent the commitments to affordable housing. So, but however, only the Secretary of the Treasury has the authority to deem a foreclosure illegitimate for LIHTC purposes, and formal guidance has not been issued on this. And so as a result, we have Michigan families that are wrongfully losing access to affordable housing, which is absolutely critical to them because developers want to charge more. And I wonder if this is something that you are seeing more broadly with members, and if so, what can we do to fix this?
Thank you, Senator. We have heard of it. It's not happened in Utah, and I understand Michigan has that problem, and it may be unique, but possibly not either. But we know that S548 may have some language in there that will help to correct that so that the allocating entities are the ones who can make that determination. We've had, I think, very good compliance in the state of Utah, maintaining those properties through the extended use periods and beyond. We require that properties have a 50-year compliance period beyond, so that's beyond what the federal government requires. But we've not had any who have threatened to do that. I think it's possible that it could happen, and so we welcome the changes it would take in S548 to enable us to handle that as opposed to the Treasury.
Do you know if there have been discussions with Treasury or how they've reacted? I mean, is this at this point isolated, do you think, to Michigan, or have you heard from other people? And wondering if there's any real discussion going on about this.
I don't think so much discussion because I think it is fairly rare, and we do know, and I have heard that Michigan has that problem. So that's why I say perhaps it's unique. But my understanding is that when Treasury has been notified of the problem, they've chosen to take no action.
Thank you. Well, we need to fix that in this process. Yes.
If I may, on this
Mr.
issue,
McDonald.
in Texas, the state, in their qualified allocation process, detailed an identity of interest of who could and who could not foreclose. And it boiled down to that obviously lenders need to have the preservation right to foreclose, or a syndicator if they have someone who's not taking care of their asset like they should. But after that, it's just not allowed. I think it's very similar. I understand the GAO's problem in auditing the tax credit program, but what makes the tax credit program so wonderful is that it has 50 QAPs, and it's very regionalized. It's not a one-size-fits-all program. So we tend to maybe have something that a best practices idea like this, or like what's being proposed in this bill, could go forward, and maybe something that should circulate more to the other 50 states, but like we have in Texas on this one. But the decentralization has its negatives, but it also has its positives, in that the program is customized for a region, for a state.
Thank you. And Mr. McDonald, on a different note, again, it's rental housing, affordable housing. It's also affordable purchasing and people being able to get into home ownership and so on as well. And I wondered, we all know what happened with the financial crisis, and we lost $7 trillion in home equity. And shocking differences. I'm sure it's happened in other places, but home values in some locations in Michigan were unbelievable, actually, how far they dropped. And people are just now coming back a little bit. Finally, with the recovery, they're starting to build up a little bit of equity in their home again. When we go into tax reform, one of my concerns is that there are proposals that would limit the value of the mortgage interest deduction for families, and with a major increase in the standard deduction. With that, fewer taxpayers would itemize, as we know, and that means home ownership would not be a benefit in terms of the mortgage interest deduction unless you owned a very large home. So this is also a concern to me, and I wondered if you might talk about the different proposals and the impacts that they would have on working families who are finally starting to regain their equity after being underwater for so long.
Yes, ma'am. It's very important that the mortgage interest deduction be preserved. However, we also need to keep the same amount of funds flowing into housing that are generated under the existing tax code. There's several alternatives for that. A first buyer home assistance purchase program is very, very important, and that's something that's administered on a statewide basis too through the housing agencies. Additionally, there's been a lot of discussion in reference to a tax credit, a home buyer's tax credit and a homeowner's tax credit, and that could be a very efficient way to augment the mortgage interest deduction as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Senator Cantwell. What now?
I'd say that was a follow-up to a question you asked.
Yeah.
Is my colleague from Georgia next, Mr. Chairman? Mr. Chairman, are we going back and forth? Oh, okay, all right. Okay, well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I so appreciate my colleague from Georgia and his help on all of this. And Mr. Chairman, thank you for holding this hearing along with Ranking Member Wyden, and thank you for your work on this legislation. I so appreciate everything our witnesses have said. I actually disagree with very little that's been discussed so far. And wanted to point out that the reason, I went to Chairman Hatch about this to begin with, Mr. Whittaker, was your great work in Utah on the veterans homelessness issue and the fact that you guys have driven that down to such a low rate or next to zero is just so impressive in the United States of America to take that population that we owe so much to and deliver for them on affordable housing. I so appreciate that, and I have a question on that. But I did want to emphasize a couple of things in these points that were made. The first fact that we have 15 million people, as Ms. Reagan was talking about, and that the projections are getting worse, that 2025 number, like if we do nothing, this is just going to be exacerbated. And you both mentioned, several people mentioned the 25% increase in renters over the last 10 years, which is the largest on record. That is just unbelievable to me, unless you stop and think about the implosion of the economy during that time period, and then you realize, yes, those who are on the last rung of the ladder literally fell off the ladder, so there was no more rungs, and that this 10%, the lack of supply, that's the crazy thing. But I guess, Mr. McDonald, you'd say that's not so unusual either, because if you had an implosion of the economy, then you also had the lowest production of rental housing in 40 years because of this crisis. So I guess, if anything, you've illuminated for many of us things that we knew, that this is both a urban and a rural problem, that there are places like Jackson, Mississippi, or Baton Rouge that are just right up there with Miami and other places, and that there's places like Clark, Iowa, or Douglas, Nevada, that it's everywhere. And so the one thing that I haven't heard talk about is that I've heard this number that 90% of the affordable housing units are built with the tax credit. I don't know if somebody can clarify that information, but that the majority of affordable units do use a tax credit. So when you look at that chart and you say that this is increasing, if we don't increase the tax credit, how are we going to get out of this crisis? And also for Mr. McDonald, I've also heard that the discussion of tax reform has actually suppressed the amount of capital going into this, so that we're actually going to see in 2017 and 2018 a decrease in the amount of affordable housing at the very moment that we're at this crisis. And we know that the tax credit is the dial to help create more supply, that we're actually seeing a decrease in just because people are waiting to see, or just this uncertainty. So I don't know if anybody, if Mr. McDonald, you can address that, or Ms. Reagan, if you can address that. But Mr. Whittaker, I do want to hear about the veteran success in Utah.
Well, you're exactly right. After the November elections and the first thoughts of tax reform came out, and the 15% tax bracket was announced, it had an extreme impact on credit prices. And it was mainly the fear of the unknown. People didn't realize where it was going. The syndicators were petrified, and they went to a stop. I mean, there was a point where they fell in price, and then they just wouldn't purchase credits at all. And it came to a grinding halt. I think that now that there's been more discussion of tax reform, the reality is that we're not going to have a 15% rate in all likelihood. You people know better than I, but it's probably more in terms of a 25% rate. And so it's not going to be as dramatic, as soften it some. We've seen some recovery in prices. But I will tell you that the fixing of the 4% rate, as this bill does, is the perfect way to fix that problem, because it puts the money back into the program even if the credit price does not recover. And by fixing the 4% rate and getting the bond prices back up, you pick up 25% more funds, so you more than offset the loss in what the credit price is.
Okay. Ms. O'Regan, is this the primary tool that we have to fixing this crisis?
This absolutely is on the affordable side of the market. So I have heard the 90% number. I have not checked it myself, so I will say it's in the range of that in terms of the role that LIHTC plays for the creation of affordable housing at the low end of rent. So what we know is that when markets are responding, they're responding and producing at the very high end. The bulk of units that come into the low rent market are what economists call filtered down. They're units that exist, that as they age, their value goes down and they're lower rent. The tighter the housing market, the less likely that units filter down. In fact, in very tight markets, you see them filtering up. So units that were affordable are no longer affordable, and the production that comes in is at the top of the market. And so what you need to be doing is having a mechanism for producing along a range of price points, and it is only with these types of subsidies that you're going to relieve any of the pressure at the low end of the market.
So you're saying basically the only thing we have to do is to turn this dial. If we think we're going to make
we need to turn this dial, and I think a point that Professor Mcclure was making, and to the extent that we want the dial to go as deep as 30% of income, we want some of the other reforms that are in your proposal in 548 to be able to have a little bit of the ability to reach deeper in the income level.
Well, I can't emphasize enough how this is a crisis across many parts of our country. I can tell you from Seattle to Walla Walla, the housing crisis is real. And many times it's trying to help either the senior population or the veteran population. So, Mr. Whittaker, how did you address the veteran population in your state?
It was in conjunction with a housing authority, Salt Lake County Housing Authority specifically, put an application into us for 9% credits, and one of the things that they proposed is that a proportion of those units be set aside for homeless. So they had they got points for that, and they have rents at levels such that people coming out of a homeless situation could afford them, or they would have set aside vouchers for them. As it turns out, this property was such a unique property because initially it wasn't even welcome in the neighborhood. And since it's been built, it's a real jewel, and it's appreciated very much. And many of the residents who are residing there are those who have been veterans who were formerly homeless. And they've got a good camaraderie going there. And also the service providers who need to be there for issues related to addictions and mental health cases and so forth. They have a single place to go that they can help a lot of people in one spot. And that's made this project in particular successful. But we have quite a number of other projects that are doing something similar.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McDonald, of the 4,700 units, I believe you said you'd built 4,700 units, low-income housing units. Yes, sir. How many of those do you own now as a owner with tenants?
4,700.
All 4,700?
Yes, sir.
Were the tax credit program not available, would you have had that big an investment?
No, sir. Not. We would have never had the ability to have been able to raise capital and offer a portfolio with affordable rents. It would just not have been a viable alternative at all.
The reason I make that point is Senator Cantwell is exactly right. The only way you meet the future shortage and the existing shortage today is to have the program that attracts the money into it. If you don't do what you need to do, the money will go somewhere else, and then you'll have a bigger problem than you had before. And I think that program was great. So all 4,700 were rental units in multifamily buildings?
Some are multifamily buildings. We also have some single family. We did a neighborhood revitalization program in San Angelo, Texas, where the city gave us the lots for $1,000. And we built 36 scattered single-family homes there, for example. And it jump-started a community revitalization in the whole area. People started fixing up the entire area because of it. And we do both multifamily and single-family.
Well, Mr. Chairman, one point I wanted to make. There are two tax credit programs created by Congress. One is the Conservation Easement Tax Credit Program, and the other is the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, both of which have generated a lot of land to go into conservation and a lot go into low-income housing. There have been some attacks on both those programs in terms of the syndicators and others that question their validity. And so one of the things we have to be sure we don't do, we want to make sure the integrity of the programs that raise the money by the syndicators are correct. We want to make sure there's no misrepresentation or otherwise mishandling of the funds. But we have to realize that is such an attractive program. It's the only way we're going to have money flowing into two things that meet the test of what we want to give a tax credit for. And instead of the government taking tax money and investing in land to buy it for conservation easements, or the government getting in the business of building housing projects, we're incentivizing the private sector to build projects utilizing the capital that's invested by individual investors who recover their capital investment by tax credit earned over time. Am I not correct? Absolutely. So it has a multiplier effect in terms of what it does for generating more moderate income housing, and it's a solid program, and it also has about as many motivations as you can have in a program to incentivize the developer and the owner to take care of the property, to make sure it doesn't become a blighted property, and make sure it's a great property. Is that not correct?
Absolutely, sir. We have what seems to be a continual audit. We're being examined by our lenders, by our syndicators. If we have Section 8 vouchers, we're being reviewed on those. And then, of course, our state agency is out every year, goes through our books and records, notices what we're doing with our rents, makes sure it does a property evaluation, does a complete needs assessment for our property, gives us 90 days to fix it. If it doesn't get fixed, they issue an 8609 and we lose our tax credits. And we take it very, very seriously. I realize that's hard to track from a GAO standpoint, but on a local basis, there is a lot of oversight and to make sure that the compliance in this program is being carefully monitored.
In terms of cost of your units, what percentage of the cost of the average unit that you build goes to regulatory costs like impact fees and things like that?
Approximately 25%.
Senator Wyden asked the question a little bit ago. He's gone now. I'll try to remember to tell him this, but when we talk about what local governments can do to help make it easier to bring the projects to fruition and bring housing programs in, is look at your regulatory burden of cost on the developer to build a project in and of itself. Mr. Whittaker, I think, was talking about the homeless veterans program. We had I chair the Veterans Affairs Committee. We had a family, a veteran, in 1906 to give 300 acres in West Los Angeles to the VA. That zip code is now 90210, so it's a pretty good location if you know what that means, Beverly Hills. And they are going to use a lot of that land to build housing for veterans who have been homeless. And it's going to be because the local government's going to exercise some authority it has in zoning and land use and restrictions to motivate and incentivize the private sector to build the housing so the veterans will have the housing on that project. So it's a great way to provide housing. I'm a big supporter of Ms. Cantwell's program. It's a good program. It's passed the test of time. And if we don't do it, I can't think of any other way to get capital flowing, private capital flowing, to generate the housing necessary to house the American people. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Senator Menendez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think it's an incredibly important hearing. I appreciate my colleague from Washington driving the opportunity for the hearing, and I want to make the case for her specific legislation by speaking about some of the other issues that we have in housing that only strengthen the need for her legislation. In New Jersey and across the nation, low-income households, including seniors living on fixed incomes, people with disabilities, and families with children are struggling to find affordable places to call home. For the lowest income families, New Jersey faces a shortage of more than 212,000 homes that are affordable and available. And that problem is exacerbated by the fact that only 1 out of every 4 eligible low-income households receive federal rental assistance. So I can't help but point out that the President's fiscal year 2018 budget request slashes HUD's funding by more than $7 billion. That would turn this crisis into an epidemic. By eliminating programs like CDBG and Home, cutting public housing funds to the bone, eliminating 250,000 housing choice vouchers, failing to provide sufficient funding for project-based assistance renewals, and requiring low-income families, seniors, and people with disabilities to pay more in rent, the President is clearly not in tune with the housing crisis that we have in this country. So, Mr. Whittaker, could you comment on how the elimination of the Community Development Block Grant Program and the Home Investment Partnership would impact the affordable housing crisis?
I can surely talk about the home program because that's what funds a fund in Utah that we call the Olene Walker Housing Loan Fund. Olene Walker was a former lieutenant governor and ultimately governor of the state of Utah who had very ideal outlook for affordable housing. And this funds this program, and this provides the gap funding. So when we have a project that is submitted to us, and in order to score points, one of the things that they will do is to offer up some of the units for very, very low income. Those that are extremely low income, below 35% AMI, typically at 25% AMI. Those units receive rents that are very low, and that doesn't contribute a lot of revenue to the project. So they're funded with their mortgage and they're funded with the tax credits, but those units at that very low level have a very difficult time supporting themselves. So they go to this other funding source and use that for gap funding. They get soft seconds, sometimes grants, but usually soft seconds. And that home money is what keeps that program going in Utah. And I think that's the same as it is for other areas. CDBG, I'm not so familiar with.
I appreciate your answer on home. Professor O'Regan, how would you view affordable housing efforts? Would they be hampered if Congress were to enact large-scale cuts in the housing voucher program and create greater income payments by low-income households?
Thank you, Senator. Yes. There is an incredible overlap between the units that HUD funds and developments that also use the tax credit. About 47% of LIHTC units receive some type of rental assistance, and most of that is project-based or voucher-based. LIHTC owners are not allowed to discriminate on source of income, so the LIHTC stock itself is critically important for voucher households as they go around and try to find units that they can rent. The home funding is one of the gap funding. CDBG is also paired with broader community redevelopment, and LIHTC is usually a big infusion of capital into those plans. So the streams on the ground, up here at the federal level, these are very separate. On the ground, these are tools that you're using in your communities to be able to address the issues. And the flexible tools, such as home and CDBG, those going away make it even more difficult because you're looking for things that can work well with the plans that you're putting together.
Let me follow up on that with, as the low-income housing tax credit program sets income limits at 50%, 60% of area median income. However, extremely low-income households have incomes that are less than 30% of area median income. For those households, the vast majority of who face severe cost burdens, paying more than 50% of their incomes on rent, the low-income housing tax credit alone is not enough to make a home affordable. You highlight this issue in your testimony. Can you explain why additional subsidies, be it project-based, tenant-based, rental assistance, are critical to ensuring the lowest income families are served by the low-income housing tax credit?
Yes. So I think the point that Mr. Whittaker made is there's a gap. There's a penciling gap, right? So if the rents are work out financially at 50 or 60% of AMI to go all the way to 30, you're going to need something else. But I will point out, 58%, 59% of tenants in LIHTC units have incomes below $20,000 a year. So right now, state HFAs are piecing together a collection of things. A lot of it is HUD funding to be able to reach deep. So as the HUD budget changes, you are not going to see these units able to reach down. So we're going to see an increase in rent burdens among that group purely outside of the LIHTC allocation, but because of other parts of what's happening in the budget. State and local areas, jurisdictions, put their own money in. As other money goes away, their budgets are going to shift. They may not be have the ability to put their resources in this kind of patchwork that makes the system work as well as it does currently.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for you all for being here this morning. Mr. McDonald, affordability and accessibility go hand in hand when it comes to housing. Fannie and Freddie use an old credit scoring model that doesn't take into account rent, utility payments, your cell phone bill payments, things that actually show a broader swath of the credit history of the borrower. Why is it so important for the GSEs to start considering this data? Who stands to benefit? And I will note that Senator Warner and myself have legislation that we introduced today to hopefully help the GSEs update their credit scoring model.
Senator, I want to thank you for the legislation you filed, and we really look forward to studying it. It's an issue that has been at the forefront of home builders for quite some time, probably since '08 when the downturn in the economy came, and we were trying to find out why all of a sudden we were having so many prospective home buyers who were losing the opportunity to purchase homes. And we sat down with our economics department, and we have 4 or 5 of the smartest PhDs I've ever met in my life. And we said, tell us how FICO works. Mm-hmm. Sir, after about 30 days, they came back and they couldn't figure it out. Mm. We need a system that's transparent so that you know and you know and you know exactly how that score that controls your life and what kind of housing you're going to be able to provide your family is made up. So you know what to do and how to improve it, how to work with it, how to work toward having good credit. Good credit shouldn't be an accident. It should be something that you work at as a goal, and if you understand the rules that you're playing back, it's a lot easier to play the game.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, sir.
Yes, sir.
Appreciate your passion as well. Mr. Diaz Garcia, I have a question for you on a different topic. So often in the discussion about home ownership and affordability, manufacturing housing, it just goes unnoticed. And in South Carolina, 1 out of every 5 homes is indeed a prefabricated home, the highest percentage in the nation. At the same time, the average household income for a manufactured homeowner is around $30,000 versus about $52,000 nationwide. The folks that buy manufactured housing are the least equipped to deal with rising costs. A 2014 GAO study found that high financing costs often keep these homes from being even more affordable. What conclusions did the GAO reach on improving manufacturing homes and their affordability?
We're the report that you're referring to, and I don't have an exact answer, but I'll be more than happy to reach out to your staff and provide you with information and perhaps information I can submit for the record on the work that we've done on financing manufactured homes.
Thank you very much. Back to you, Mr. McDonald. I liked your passion, so I'm going to ask you another question here. You testified that many home builders struggle to fill vacancies because the workforce lacks the skills necessary, whether it's welding, carpentry, plumbing. This shortage of qualified workers prevents housing inventories from keeping pace and ultimately leads to higher costs. I've worked on legislation around apprenticeship programs, and I think that one of the ways we improve the housing inventory is to help folks earn and learn at the exact same time on the job sites. How can we ensure more Americans are ready for the skilled labor jobs that are high paying?
we currently, right at the National Association of Home Builders this year, are sponsoring 8,400 people in the apprenticeship programs. These programs are exceptionally important. The average age of a master plumber in Texas is 61 years old. The average age of a master electrician in Texas is 59 years old. That's a recipe for disaster. We are not having the skilled people come into our workforce. And part of it is we've got to go back to moms and dads and school counselors who will tell young people that it's not a bad thing if you don't go to college, that you go to a trade and technical school. We've also got to start offering more trade technical school education in our high schools and for people to use so that they can develop the job skills where they can make a wonderful living and have a wonderful career, possibly own their own business, and then not be burdened by student debt.
Absolutely. And look, I know I'm running out of time, Mr. Chairman, but I will close by saying that there's dignity in all work. I recall back in my days in high school, just about a few years ago, Mr. Brown was there with me in a different state. The reality of it was we had shop when I was in high school. We need to restore dignity in all work and encourage every facet of this society to participate and encourage the fact that there's strong income as a welder. I understand in Texas you can make over $125,000 a year as a welder. There's really good jobs.
I'm a licensed welder, thank you.
Exactly, it works. So we have problems that we can solve if we work together towards those solutions. Thank you very much to all of you guys for being here today.
Well, thank you, Senator. Senator Brown.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm flattered that Senator Scott thinks we're in high school at the same time, but thank you for that. Mr. McDonald, thank you.
I need your co-sponsorship on the legislation, too. There's that.
Nice try. Thank you, Mr. McDonald, for your comments about the importance of the trades. And thank you for your passion about that and reminding people that how important it is that young people become carpenters and machinists and sheet metal workers and plumbers and electricians. A couple of comments and then I have questions for Ms. O'Regan and for Mr. Whittaker, if I could. Families, as we know, families burdened by high housing costs have fewer resources, obviously, to meet other needs like food, transportation to work, medicine, and may face homelessness and eviction. As the sociologist Matthew Desmond says, the rent eats first. A person with a full-time job would need to earn an hourly wage of $21 to afford a modest two-bedroom rental at HUD's national average fair market rate. This housing wage, for want of a better term, varies along with housing costs across the country. Fact remains there are only 12 counties in the U.S. where a full-time worker earning federal minimum wage can afford a modest one-bedroom rental home. My home state of Ohio, a more affordable state than many others. The state's the average housing wage is still $15. The state's minimum wage is $8.15. The mean renter wage is $12.87. My wife and I live in Cleveland in zip code 44105. 10 years ago, that zip code had more foreclosures than any zip code in the United States of America. So we see every day the blight that comes from people not being able to afford decent places to live. The low-income housing tax credit's a critical tool, as you know from your service in the administration, in developing affordable housing. Certainly should be protected and expanded, regardless of whether tax reform develops into a real bipartisan process or remains the partisan fantasy that too many people here talk about it, as people here talk about. Yet all of you today, and as witnesses, the mismatch between housing costs and wages goes far beyond the cost of building and operating affordable units. I'm the ranking member of the Banking Committee, Banking, Housing, and Urban Affairs Committee. We've had a lot of discussion of the President's proposed 15% cut in HUD funding. Senator Menendez asked you a moment ago about that. This proposal goes in the wrong direction. How can you provide more affordable rental and home purchases when you make such savage cuts to affordable housing? So my question, Professor O'Regan, first for you, can you discuss additional steps that Congress and HUD should take to address the needs of rent-burdened working families? And then the question for both you and Mr. Whittaker. Pediatrician Megan Sandel likens affordable housing to a vaccine. due to its ability to improve or not improve children's health and other outcomes. So if the two of you would talk about what we know about the effect that the lack of safe, healthy, affordable housing has on children's health. So if, Ms. Regan, if you'd answer both questions, and Mr. Whittaker, if you would take the second question. Thank you.
Okay. So I'll start with the need for resources. The need for resources on affordable housing are broad. The hit on the HUD budget is going to be felt severely around the country. So I'm not in a position, I'm no longer at HUD, and I'm not in a position to affect the federal budget, but it's hard to, you want to find ways in which the resources do not get cut for those most at need. I know there are a number of other proposals being considered, things like renter tax credits, things that can be used that would actually focus on the lowest and in greatest need at a time when other types of resources are becoming less available. Additional flexibility within the tax credit, so resources can be used in more than one way, is a way to help fill those gaps. As the home funding goes away, which is gap and which is sort of fungible funding, you're going to need to look for other places where it can come in. On the vaccine part, I would like to highlight one piece of work that came out from HUD called the Family Options Study. I think it is the most rigorous and best evidence to date on the effect of stable, affordable housing on outcomes for children and on non-housing outcomes, radiating benefits that came from homeless families who were provided with long-term housing subsidies. Within 3 years, a whole collection of additional impacts were seen. Domestic violence went down in these families. Family separations were significantly lower. Kids were less mobile across school and across daycare. And by the third year follow-up, you were seeing pro-social behavior and a collection of all of those outcomes that the longer-term health studies show are directly connected to adult health and mental well-being. And I think that researchers will be following that study for the next 5 years and be using it to show exactly the direct correspondence between stable, affordable housing and good outcomes for kids.
Thank you. Senator Cassidy? Oh, I'm sorry.
Didn't answer, but thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah.
Well, mine will be short because I'm not much of a health expert, actually, but we do know for a fact that households who are on the cusp of just being able to afford their daily lives, paying the rent and the necessary food and so forth for their families, anything such as a significant car repair is something that can throw them into homelessness. And a homeless family, those with children, there's nothing more pathetic than to go to the areas of Salt Lake City where we see that on a daily basis and see a shopping cart with mom and dad in tow with kids with all their goods in that shopping basket walking down the street. That's all they have. And we know that's an unhealthy situation for those families.
Well, thank you. Senator Cassidy?
Mr. McDonald, good to see you.
Yes, sir.
I love your industry. Folks start off swinging a hammer, they end up being quite an entrepreneur. It is really tremendous. And so just to compliment you, and we've met before, so just to mention that. Now, when I read y'all's testimony, I end up a little bit kind of like that, as if it's pointing in different directions. Nothing against your testimony, very provocative, but let me kind of toss this out. Mr. Mcclure, you quote some of Ms. O'Regan's research, and so on the one hand, there's data showing that if you ghettoize low-income people, that's negative. So, Mr. Mcclure, you point out, or Dr. Mcclure, I'm sure I can't read, when you're on this side, you can't see what the labels are. So, so you suggest that we should have more policy forcing integration, if you will, of lower income into richer neighborhoods. Sounds great, except Mr. McDonald's testimony points out that wealthier people tend to live near transit centers, probably live near better schools, better restaurants, better, et cetera. That increases your development cost. So we have kind of a pushback there because it's going to increase your cost of the program. And similarly, when you speak about those being underserved, I think you quoted Ms. O'Regan's research, that most of these programs are for those who are kind of 40 to 60,000, not for less than 20,000. But there's a certain, when you're down in that level of poverty, there tends to be more economic segregation. Folks don't live near transit centers. They don't live near nice Whole Foods as a rule, although there's a nice place in New Orleans, Whole Foods near such a neighborhood. So I just toss that out because it seems like the recommendations and the reality kind of go against each other. Yes, we need more housing for those who have reportable incomes of less than $20,000, but that's going to increase your housing development cost, which, yes, you want to integrate those folks into the broader social fabric, but the nature of such a neighborhood, social indicators may make it more difficult to do so. How do we reconcile that?
Thank you, Senator. You are correct. It's an enormously tricky process. What we have now is a one-size-fits-all tax credit program with very few flexibilities built into it. We have built an entire industry of developers, underwriters, nonprofits who have found ways to layer subsidy on top of subsidy on top of subsidy to come up with some very impressive results. If we could make the low-income housing tax credit program more flexible, if we would reward the type of developments that better serve those households truly in need, our outcomes would improve in the program.
I'd like to join in on that. I think the making it work by having the ability within the program to be flexible is quite useful. But you did point out something that is kind of inherent. Locational goals may be in conflict.
Totally.
And so I think this is where the benefit of it being a decentralized program is, where localities that have the housing market in front of them and the needs get to be flexible there is important. But I want to point out one thing on the research that's important for thinking about them potentially not being in such conflict. There's very good work by Rebecca Diamond and Timothy McQuaid who have looked at the effect of creating low-income housing, the LIHTC housing, in higher poverty neighborhoods and find robust findings that those investments themselves pay off in the neighborhood. That if you look at the properties nearby, the housing values go up by more than 6%, crime rates go down, and you see larger benefits.
Now, that suggests that good money drives out bad people.
No, the group that you see composition coming in differently. You'll see higher income households coming in, so the economic and racial composition of the neighborhood changes over time. So it's a community reinvestment strategy. And so if you think about the place-based side of this, where the LIHTC development goes in now, 5 years in the future, looks different. And so that's one way to think about some of the benefits you get on that locational side.
Okay, I get that. Now, also, it's interesting. I was just in North Baton Rouge, an area, lower socioeconomic class in Louisiana, and after the flooding, they've lost a lot of their rental stock. And so the local pastor was saying, they're not rebuilding our rental homes, which means that I'm losing my congregation. We're losing the fabric of our community. So your point, sir, that perhaps we need to reward rehabilitation a little bit more than new construction, certainly would put maybe solve some of that. I will concede that. And if you go to New Orleans, sometimes older neighborhoods are closer to transit sites, hubs, if you will. They're just older neighborhoods. So it does seem like rehabilitation would be part of the answer. I'll just kind of commend your testimony on that.
Well, and I also think that the 4% side of this bill will aid that rehabilitation. It'll heighten it, and we have to realize that the rehabilitation is really a strong position. Because we're starting to get older and older units that need the work. We have to do something to revitalize some of these neighborhoods, and the tax credit program does a wonderful job of that. I agree that in a perfect world we would try to build in more affluent areas, but the problem is that the real estate costs in the more affluent areas, everything else, then would reduce the amount of units we're able to get on the ground to assist families. So if we're going to get the most bang for our buck, we need to let that stay as a state's issue when they write their QAPs, that those people back home and trust the people back home know exactly where they need to develop and what's the best for their community. In Texas, we'll see the need for revitalization, and you will see an entire set-aside for revitalization. And that's very important. We wouldn't want to do anything to slight that. They know exactly how at home to monitor this. They know what's good in Baton Rouge for what needs to happen in the rest of North Baton Rouge.
Got it. Thank you all very much.
Senator Cardin.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I just really wanted to sort of summarize and thank all the witnesses for being here, and particularly thank the Chairman, Senator Cantwell, for your leadership on this issue. We need your leadership. Affordable housing is more challenging today than ever before. And the statistics that were brought out today indicate that we need to have stronger tools available in order to meet the needs of the people of this country. And I think the legislation the two of you have authored gives us a way to move forward in the best traditions of this committee and Senate. So I first want to thank you all. I also want to just make an acknowledgement. As I see the work that's done in Maryland, whenever we can get a program started to provide additional affordable housing for people in need, there is not usually one tool available that will make that happen. You sort of have to rely on a lot of different opportunities. No question, the low-income housing tax credit is the major tool that's available, and strengthening that tool will be the most important thing I believe we can do for affordable housing. But the historic tax credits are a major part. We had over 5,000 units, I think, of residential that was created under the historic tax credits. That's another important tool that's available that is combined many times with low-income housing tax credits. We have the new market tax credits that can be a helpful part of getting this done. We have incentives for energy efficiency, which can be coupled with these projects that accomplish additional savings for the people who live there on their energy costs, but also help us in regards to our energy policies in this country. That can also help us deal with those issues. So as we look at improving the low-income housing tax credit, which I think we definitely strongly support, I think we should be also mindful of the other tools that are available to look at ways that they can be strengthened and in some cases more targeted to the objective of affordable housing. I'm not squeamish about looking at ways we can make these programs more effective. We need to do that. But at the same time, we need to expand them and provide greater resources in order to do with the tremendous needs that we have in our community. So I know that in Maryland, I've seen some, I should mention also, we couldn't do this without the private sector. The private sector takes incredible risk at times in order to carry out a public function of affordable housing. They're committed to that. So it's all of that coming together that has allowed us to move forward in Maryland on the affordable housing issues. And I look forward to working with all the stakeholders to find ways that we can improve the programs. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thanks, Senator. Senator Thune?
Last person there, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, as far as I know.
Okay. Well, thank you. And thank you to all of you for being with us today. We appreciate you taking time away from your jobs and families to testify this morning.
You're great.
Affordable housing is an important issue for each of us in our states across the country. And we're fortunate in my state of South Dakota to have one of the lowest unemployment rates in the nation, but we still have a need for housing that lower income individuals, especially those just getting started, are able to afford. Now, there are a number of federal programs and provisions of the tax code that are intended to help provide affordable housing in this country, both in urban areas and rural parts of the nation as well. And as we turn to tax reform as our top priority, we have an opportunity to look at a lot of these tax provisions to make sure that they're working effectively and efficiently. And your insights this morning are an important contribution to that effort. So thank you again for being here. As part of tax reform, many of us on the committee have been looking at the important role that cost recovery can play in helping ensure long-term economic growth. And while much of the testimony this morning has focused on the low-income housing tax credit, I understand that depreciation is also a significant component of the financing of affordable housing projects. However, the current recovery period of 27.5 years can create a significant lock-in effect for residential housing investment. So the question is, if tax reform were to include a shorter recovery period for residential real estate or acceleration of the depreciation deductions, how would you see that affecting affordable housing projects? And I will just throw that open to the panel. Mr. McDonald.
Well, it would obviously bring down the price. 26 years is better than 27, 25 would be better than 26. So however you come down the scale, what you will do is help reduce the cost of producing affordable housing. And I don't think there's anyone in this room that won't say that's a great idea.
Okay. Anybody else? Everybody's for that? All right. The focus on affordable housing is often centered on our larger cities and the surrounding suburbs, but there's also a need for affordable housing in states like South Dakota, which are largely rural. In these areas, we often need housing properties that are smaller, since low-income individuals are more dispersed than in larger cities. Due to their smaller scale, these housing projects may not be as financially feasible as those being developed in urban communities. And some have suggested that enhancing the low-income housing credit to encourage financing for affordable housing in rural areas. So the question is, do you agree that the low-income housing, or I should say that low-income housing in rural areas presents challenges for using the current low-income housing tax credit, and what do you think might be the most effective enhancement to the credit that we could come up with that would address this issue? Yes, sir.
Well, Senator Cantwell's got it right here. And the ability to adjust DDAs and the difficult to develop areas and give the economic boost and to allow the states to do that when they write their QAPs on a local area basis, so that in South Dakota or in Texas, they can reach deep and give that boost to the rural areas, which in Texas they do, and that's what allows the development of affordable housing in rural Texas.
Okay. Anybody else? Yeah, Ms.
I think this is correct, that the bill actually has several things in it that would help with rural communities, including the difference, making a change on the income definitions. I think the income averaging gives you a broader market so that you'd be able to actually be able to support this in rural areas. And I'm going to just second the DDA designation so that Indian areas are automatically designated as difficult to develop, which comes with the basis boost.
Okay. All right. Well, that's... those are my questions, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thank you all for being here.
Senator Cantwell really deserves the credit for this hearing. And she's a very integral and important member of this committee. Senator Cantwell, you have a...
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would say you're a very integral part of this committee as well.
Well, that's good to know.
And Utah has been a very integral leader in this issue, and so I thank them again for pioneering and piloting. I don't know all the ways in which Utah has been able to muster that, but I am admiring of it, so thank you. And I just wanted to bring up one last point does doing nothing save us any money? Because one of the things that I have heard that dealing with this population, I know there's some studies, but that dealing with this population is costing us $3 billion more because everything is more expensive if you're dealing with the same population without a roof over their head, or as my colleague Senator Scott was talking about, apprenticeship. Well, I guarantee you cannot deliver job training to a tent. It just doesn't work. And so how do we communicate about the fact that doing nothing isn't really saving us any money here?
I would say that one of the things that a language that's used on this frequently is the wrong pocket issue, which is there's incredibly increasing body of evidence on the role of affordable and stable housing for non-housing outcomes, for improvements in health, mental well-being, for economic mobility for children. So the lack of affordable housing shows up in the budgets and outside of the housing budgets. And so how do you get the attention of those who care about that range of outcomes to realize that investing in housing now decreases all of those other costs over time?
Do we know of a specific analysis of that now, or could you help us with CBO in scoring that in some way? Because
the bane of my existence when I had my previous job trying to get to this. But I think the best evidence is on supportive housing, on all of the immediate cost savings from emergency room visits and actually from implications in the criminal justice system. So we've got very robust evidence there. And the more recent evidence with homeless families where we're seeing outcomes that will down the pike would hit the budget. But certainly on the ones that are most robust on supportive housing, we could get that to you.
Well, somebody mentioned to me they thought the number was 25% per person. It costs 25% more to deal with someone who is in this homeless situation than it is to have a roof over their head because of all those health care costs and expenses. I don't know, Mr. Whittaker, if you've seen or could comment on that.
I can't comment on statistics, but one of the things that we are beginning to see in our state is the health insurers who are becoming very involved in investing in the tax credit projects. The supportive housing project that we just funded most recently with some leftover funding has a major investment by one of the health insurers in Utah because they understand that going forward, in getting people into a home is going to be cheaper for them than it is to deal with their health issues, particularly related to people who are moving into supportive housing from homelessness.
So health insurers are investing in affordable housing?
Yes.
Because they think it helps drive down costs of health insurance?
Isn't that amazing?
Thank you. Mr. McDonald, anything else on that point?
I just want to second the comment about the criminal justice system because, there's no way of ascertaining the costs there, but the end result of homelessness and despair puts an impact on criminal justice.
Thank you. Again, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership on this issue. And again, I thank all those in the Utah area who've created great models for us to follow.
Well, thank you. I want to thank you for your leadership on this in this area. This wouldn't have happened without you. I just want to say this is one of the best panels that I've seen in all my years as a member of this committee. You folks have really been right on. You've made your points very well, and I think you've been very persuasive, and you've been coordinated with each other, which is very, very good as far as I'm concerned. We appreciate you taking the time to help us to understand this better, and hopefully we can do a better job than we've done in the past. I want to thank again Senator Cantwell and other members of this committee for the work that they're doing on this, and we'll just go from there. With that, any other questions that people have, we'll want them to get them in as soon as possible, and we'll adjourn this particular meeting at this particular time. Thank you.